Okay, everyone, I think we're going to get started now, and I will do my introduction, and people will continue to join us. Um, and definitely, if you want to tell friends, I just tweeted about it at Naomi A. Klein on Twitter, and you can tell friends to join us. It's really going to be a fantastic conversation. I could not be more excited to have this discussion with two of the people I've learned from most about what is actually going on with the deliberate misclassification of workers within the gig economy and the kind of incredible organizing that is going on that gives us some rays of hope and what the legal responses can also be. So my name is Naomi Klein. I'm the inaugural Gloria Steinem Chair in Media, Culture, and Feminist Studies at Rutgers University, as well as an author, senior correspondent at The Intercept, and a climate justice organizer. The Gloria Steinem Chair is supported by a collaboration between SCI, the WGSS department, and the Institute for Women's Leadership, all at Rutgers. And I want to thank all of these groups for their support, which allows us to bring exciting guests to Rutgers and to open them up to the community and have these really important conversations. My courses at Rutgers over the last 3 years have explored themes including surveillance capitalism, the impact of the platform economy on social movements, and the nature of life and work in the digital age. I look at technology and what is happening with the privatization of our very selves within these platforms as the latest enclosure of capitalism. Today's event, which focuses on precarity in the gig economy, is one place where all of these themes converge. In my book, The Shock Doctrine, I describe how companies use crises to advance a pre-existing wish list that enriches them at the expense of pretty much everyone else. I call this disaster capitalism. And in the midst of the COVID pandemic and a surge of racial justice uprisings, we have seen tech companies engaging in different forms of disaster capitalism as they attempt to accelerate and deepen surveillance practices in the name of security and virus control. In the midst of this, the implications for gig workers are many. The already precarious nature of so-called gig work is amplified and made more uncertain, while the conditions faced by gig workers become ever more hazardous. At the start of 2020, California passed AB 5, a glimmer of hope for gig workers that would require that companies classify them as employees instead of independent contractors. But partly under the cover of this pandemic, companies like Uber and Lyft have been trying to fight these new regulations through incredibly aggressive lobbying, marketing, misinformation, intimidation, and threats to halt operations, all while refusing to comply with the new law. This at a time when people have been more dependent on gig delivery services in order to stay safe. Then in November 2020, Prop 22 passed, a law that exempts these companies from the regulations invoked under AB 5. To shed light on all of these dynamics and talk about what the future can hold in terms of actually responding at the scale that this profound labor rights crisis demands, we have two wonderful guests, Veena Dubal and Wilfred Chen. Veena Dubal is a professor of law at UC Hastings San Francisco, right in the heart of Silicon Valley, where her research focuses on the intersection of law, technology, and precarious work. She has been cited by the California Supreme Court, and her scholarship appears in top-tier law review and peer-reviewed journals. Her commentary and research on the intersections of technology, low-wage work, and organizing, particularly in the so-called sharing or platform economy, are also regularly featured both in local and national media and in a number of documentaries. And I have, as I said, just really relied on her work and taught it in my classes. Wilfred Chen is also on the syllabus. I particularly want to welcome the students from the corporate self class who are here, but there are many more of you beyond my class who are joining us today. We've been reading Wilfred's wonderful writing in The Nation, where he's a freelance journalist. and I believe a contributing editor. He's been a gig worker for food delivery platforms in New York City and has brought that experience to bear on his writing and sharing that first person view of what it's like to be a gig worker, many of the myths about it, but also really digging deep into the economics of what's happening here. So I'm just so grateful to be able to hear from both of them, to have them in conversation and taking your questions. They're each going to talk for about 10 minutes each to lay the ground for us. And then I will be following up with some questions. And then I'm going to be taking some questions from my students, and you can put your questions in the chat. So Veena, let me go to you first to share some remarks about the state of the gig economy that is emerging from the pandemic, post Prop 22, and anything else that you want to share to ground our discussion.
Great. I'll start just by saying thank you so much to Professor Naomi Klein for inviting me. I'm honored to be here talking alongside Wilfred Chan on an issue that I think is probably one of the most important labor issues facing not just the U.S. but the broader global economy today, and that is essentially the issue of misclassification. I see a lot of people in the attendee list who know a lot about what we're talking about, who are experts in their own right, and I look forward to them joining the conversation and thank them for attending. I'll start just by saying a little bit about what the gig economy is and what it is not. So I started this work studying Uber and Lyft drivers, studying drivers who are organizing, self-organizing in California about, I want to say 7 or 8 years ago. And it emerged from an earlier project, my dissertation project, which was studying taxi workers in San Francisco. And no one really called taxi workers gig workers, although they were also treated as considered independent contractors. So that leads me to this question of what is the gig economy? How can we conceptualize it? And I want to say it is not an economy. It is not a separate sector of work. We are often talking about very different types of work, like ride hailing or food delivery, but it is rather an unlawful business model rooted in misclassification. So we're talking particularly about work, in-person service work that is dispatched through technological apps, which is often what we think of when we think of quote unquote gig work. That is work that is dispatched by the Uber app or the Lyft app or the Instacart app. There are 3 primary structural components, I think, that we can identify as being part of this work. One is that the business model itself involves carving the workers out of all protections. So what may not be obvious to everyone is that in the US, almost all of our social safety net protections flow through employment. So unemployment insurance, if you're laid off through no fault of your own, workers' compensation, minimum wage protections, overtime protections, all of these things come through employment. You don't have them if you're an independent contractor. This means that employment is more expensive than just contracting with individuals. It is the risk and responsibility of doing business. So the primary sort of component of quote unquote gig work is the misclassification of workers as of independent contractors in order to keep not just wages low or labor costs low, but actually to not have to pay for all the legal liabilities associated with work, like not having to pay out large sums of money to people who are injured, for example, third parties that are injured in accidents, etc. The second aspect of this is of this in-person service work that's dispatched through apps is paying by the piece. So this amounts to piece payment. So people are not only sort of misclassified, don't have access to the minimum wage, they are no longer paid for all the time that they spend laboring. Instead, they are paid only after work is allocated to them. They have no control over when the work is allocated to them, and they cannot know how much they are going to be paid when work is allocated to them. This all is completely out of their hands. What it does ultimately is introduce a third feature that is very specific to the tech gig work, and that is first-degree labor price discrimination. It's something that we don't talk a lot about with regard to gig work, but it is the case that because this is piecework, workers receive personalized wages based on the vast amounts of data invisibly collected on them. So the amount of money I might make after working for 50 hours in 1 week for Uber is very different from the amount of money Wilfred might make after working for 50 hours a week for the same company, because the data that they have for me is different from the data they have for Wilfred. So with that said, with these problems sort of stated, I think the difficulties and precarities of this work are quite obvious. Of course, as with any other job, workers are most concerned about their low wages, the fact that they can be terminated willy-nilly, sometimes sort of not logically, irrationally terminated, have no sort of recourse for that termination, etc. I want to hone in on the California story, both because this work began in California, or these companies began in California, and also because California has been on the forefront of trying to regulate this work in the US. So, it was in 2012 that I started hearing from taxi drivers that there were these bandit tech cabs on the street where people were driving in their own cars, stealing fares from them. I thought for sure there was no way that this was going to become a municipal trend, much less a national trend or an international trend. I thought there was no way that people are going to get in the cars of strangers and have their bodies carried from point A to point B, but I was certainly wrong, despite the fact that these companies were violating municipal regulatory frameworks, not just labor and employment laws, but actual laws that had been in place for over a century around what it meant to be a common carrier or a taxi carrier. They were allowed to function in California. Eventually, the California Public Utilities Commission created regulations legalizing the company. This was the first set of state regulations anywhere in the world, legalizing transportation network companies, that is these tech taxis, and then these laws were ultimately replicated all over the country, which made it very exciting in 2019, when the California Supreme Court came out with this decision, Dynamics, the Superior Court of LA. And what the Dynamics decision did, in indirect response to the proliferation of these companies in California, was say, in order to be an independent contractor, in order to treat your workers like independent contractors, you have to prove that you are not doing the same thing that the workers themselves are doing. So they changed the legal test for how to determine who is deserving of wage protection, specifically in California. And it became very clear that these companies could not pass the test. And so they very quickly mobilized, tried to create a carve out for themselves. They failed, largely as a result of tens of thousands of workers mobilizing in California. Again, we had self-organized drivers through Rideshare Drivers United calling what became the first global strike against Uber during this time period. Instead, the California legislature, through the leadership of Assemblywoman Lorena Gonzalez, passed AB 5, which codified the Dynamics decision in statutory law in California. This became a hotly controversial law, in large part because so many companies outside of quote unquote gig companies rely on misclassification or some kind of employment model that ultimately transfers risk and responsibility, including franchises, like 7-Eleven, including companies like Google and Facebook that use staffing agencies. If this model were to spread, this ABC test were to spread, it would really have disrupted over 50 years of business model engineering that allowed companies, specifically tech companies, to avoid having to pay workers equally and having to take on the responsibilities of business. And so there was a lot of PR money that went into fighting AB5 in California. And ultimately what the companies did was put $205 million into a proposition called Prop 22 that carved their workers. This is particularly Uber, Lyft, Instacart, DoorDash, and Postmates, which is now owned by Uber because apparently we've become a country of monopolies. And this is a historic spending, $205 million to get this proposition passed. And I just want to spend a minute saying what the proposition actually does, and I'm going to share my screen to do this. So it actually, I don't know. Now okay, there you go. Can you see this? This is from a paper that I have coming out called The New Racial Wage Code. I'm calling Proposition 22 a racial wage code because it applies specifically to workforces that are made up of by majority subordinated racial minority workers. So in the Bay Area, 78% of workers who work for ride-hail and delivery companies are subordinated racial minorities. According to Lyft's own data, about 70% of their national workforce are immigrants and subordinated racial minorities. It takes away the minimum wage from these workers. It takes away overtime from these workers. They are now reimbursed at about half of what they should be reimbursed for, and that too only after they are allocated work, which is some 40 to 60% of the time that they actually spend working. They do not get health insurance, but healthcare subsidies. They already have to have health insurance to get these subsidies. They don't get paid sick leave, no paid family leave, very limited workers' compensation in what is considered by OSHA to be one of the most dangerous jobs in the country, that is transportation work, no unemployment insurance, and only disability payments for up to 2 years. And that too, you have to meet any number of engaged hours to get those disability payments if you are injured while working, which is a very common experience, you can imagine. Although the proposition maintains that these workers are independent contractors, they are not independent contractors, because independent contractors have the ability to contract. If I am a plumber and I want to establish a relationship with Macy's, for example, to come deal with all of their plumbing issues, I can negotiate the terms of that contract. I set my own pay, I set my own hours, I set my own standards of work. These workers are now prohibited from doing those sorts of things. Really never had the capability of doing so, but they are prohibited from actually negotiating the terms of their contract. So this is a new third category of work. It is the law itself was passed, as Naomi alluded to, through a lot of misinformation. I don't believe that California workers really understood what they were voting on. It is being challenged in California Superior Court. I'm currently working on an amicus brief to support the constitutional challenge to Prop 22. And again, I would just say that there is a lot of concern that this will spread all over the world, all over the country. It is already, similar laws are being introduced in Illinois, Massachusetts, actually in Canada, and the same model has been replicated in response to the UK Supreme Court's very good decision saying that these workers are workers. I will end my 10 minutes just by saying that I don't think that employment status itself is a panacea to the working conditions that are promulgated by these very sort of morally corrupt companies. Rather, I think that it is a stepping stone to creating some stability for workers. I think in addition to employment status, we need collective power in this industry. Workers need collective power. We need an FTC that scrutinizes the mergers that we are seeing. And you know, there are a lot of sort of of interesting solutions on the table right now in light of Prop 22, many of which I'm quite skeptical of. But I would say, in addition to real democratically run unions, employment status, I would also say more broadly that we need to abolish data collection for worker or on workers in this particular line of work, where it is not the primary function of the company to collect data. And with that, I will end it and pass the mic over to Wilfred.
Thank you so much, Veena. That was extremely informative. And thank you to Professor Naomi Klein just for having me today. It's a huge honor to be here alongside you and Professor Veena Dubal. Both of you have really taught me so much.
Wilfred, you just lost audio.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me now?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. If it happens again, just let me know. My AirPods are not great sometimes. So, I really don't think of myself as an expert in this, but very much a student. And I'm just very excited to be here in conversation with both of you and all the attendees. I see some friends in the list, and also people who I've learned a lot from and interviewed and spoken to over the last few months about what's happening to gig workers. So just a little bit of intro to how I got interested in this topic and what my relationship is to gig work. So I'm a contributing writer for The Nation. I wrote a couple pieces about the before and after of Prop 22, where I got to interview Veena and learned a lot about the ins and outs of this misclassification problem. My own starting point is as a gig worker, actually. I was working as a tech copywriter in 2018, and I was very burnt out. We were writing about algorithms and using a lot of fluffy language, and I wanted to understand what this kind of notion of algorithmic control meant to people who aren't on my side of the desk, writing for a living wage, but out there in the streets and dealing with the physical consequences of it. So as a way to kind of cope with how much I didn't like my job at the time, I started riding my bike after work and doing food delivery. It helped me pay my rent, and it gave me a firsthand experience into what this all means. I signed up for DoorDash, Caviar, Postmates, Uber Eats. Each of these companies had different pay structures and different onboarding systems. This back in 2018, DoorDash actually had these in-person orientations where you'd go and you'd get a DoorDash shirt and kind of meet all these people. I understand they've phased those out because workers have actually been using those as opportunities to meet each other and organize, which is something that they don't like. But it varies across the board. And as I kind of started to experience the difficulty and also the humiliation of a lot of this work, right? You're out there, you're not interacting with anyone, you are completely beholden to the whims of this app that can punish you with no recourse, can change the rules on you without warning you, and send you into all sorts of unsafe conditions. And at the end, if you have any complaints, you can't pick up the phone and call your boss. You have to write an email through an automated form and maybe wait 3 to 5 business days for some kind of response. I felt like I needed to get more involved and try to fight back somehow. So I joined a group here in New York called the Viking Public Project, which is an advocacy.
Oh, you went out again.
Let me just turn off my AirPods.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. We'll do it this way. So
we just, Wilfred, we just lost you as you were starting to say that you started to work with a group.
The Viking Public Project, which is an advocacy group in New York that's been fighting for underrepresented cyclists, especially immigrant delivery workers. And their big issue was actually fighting against the criminalization of e-bikes in New York City, where workers were receiving $500 fines just for riding a bike that had an electric assist, right? And these were predominantly workers who couldn't speak much English, or immigrants who can't afford, to lose their bikes when they're out there already making less than minimum wage. And through BPP, I've, continued to speak to workers in New York, kind of about how they've been doing under the pandemic. And, I can share a bit of stories about that through this session. And so, I'm not the typical delivery worker, right? And this is something that I was writing about in The Nation, which is that the gig companies want you to believe that that their typical worker is someone like me, who's, kind of a happy-go-lucky entrepreneur, who's their own boss, who's just sort of a highly educated person doing this on the side for some extra cash, and they can dip in and out. When the pandemic began, I was fortunate that I had other sources of income, and I decided to stop. It wasn't worth the risk for me, but I was lucky, right? There were a lot of people who couldn't afford that luxury. And the truth is, as Veena mentioned, most of the workers who are contributing to this workforce are extremely marginalized folks. Majority are Black and brown immigrant, older people who are in various levels of economic precarity, debt situations where they just absolutely need to work between 30, sometimes 40, 50, 60, even 70 hours a week doing this kind of work in all sorts of conditions. And so the stakes are a lot higher than these companies want us to think, right? And so kind of tying it back to my original interest as that former tech copywriter and understanding how all this works, right? And delivery wasn't actually my first encounter with this kind of platform capitalism. As a journalist, I've watched the way that these social media companies are doing something similar to newspapers, to publications. So it's interesting that in both of these industries that I worked in, I've watched wages go down, economic security go down, while these extractive middlemen start to take the lion's share of the profits by reshaping these value chains, right? And what they're trying to do really is they're trying to own the relationships between the suppliers and the customers. They're trying to become, they're trying to occupy that position where they can do the least work and kind of get the most profit because everything has to flow through them. So in both journalism and in delivery and rideshare, you have these companies that are taking over these industries by aggregating exploited and kind of atomized labor, the suppliers, aggregating them, and then using and aggregating the customers, right, by using these rock bottom prices that are subsidized heavily by venture capital. And then once you have these relationships locked in, they can just force you to play by their rules. And then once they have hegemony over that market, they can force concessions from local governments, which is what we're seeing with Prop 22 and jurisdictions all across the world to further cement their dominance. So their goal is really a monopolistic one. They want to become the sole provider of these very, very important services and then raise their prices, keep cutting the wages, extract the profits. And misclassification is really at the heart of how that works, right? As Veena really helpfully described, it's a winner takes all mentality, and they need everyone else to have as little leverage as possible. And so what I've been doing for The Nation recently, I've been writing, I'm working on a piece right now which looks at not just what's happening in the US, but also around the world, because there's been some really inspiring efforts by organizers, workers, outside of our borders here. I mean, fighting back and in some cases winning these important victories against the gig companies, both in courts and at the legislative level, and also forming collective bargaining agreements with some of these companies in other markets. So there are signs of hope, right? And there's a lot of these new powerful worker-led organizations that are coming up and leading this fight. So I hope that through this talk, I can shine a light on a couple of those efforts and just help people, understand what the lay of the land is. But I'm sure I'll learn a lot from both of you and the attendees, and I'm really excited for this conversation.
Thank you so much, both of you. That was such a helpful overview. And Veena, I'm not going to call it the platform economy anymore, because I think that as you say, there's nothing new that is going on here except this deliberate, it's a business model that is simply about attacking labor rights. And and you both have come at that from different angles, but I think painted a really, really vivid picture of that. I want to, just in terms of what you just said, Wilfred, I really want to commit that we're going to save a good chunk of time at the end of this to talk about those organizing efforts, to talk about what real deeper solutions would look like beyond, as Professor Dubal talked about, just simply saying, okay, employment status is the be all and end all, because we know workers are being exploited, even when they are characterized as workers. So we will do that, but let's get a little bit deeper into how we ended up here. I'm going to be bringing in the students from my corporate self class shortly. Wilfred, you used the word extract a couple of times, and the framework that we are using in this course is really looking at these tech companies as extractivist by their very nature, right? And using an expansive definition of extractivism as not simply being about extracting resources from the earth, though it is about that too, right? But looking at different sites of extraction where value is systematically either uncounted or radically undercounted, right? And where non-consensual relationships, where you have a huge amount of power on one side and very little on the other, is exploited to just essentially seize resources in a kind of a colonial dynamic, right? And some of this builds on Shoshana Zuboff's work, and some of it kind of tries to go beyond it, right? In looking at these different sites of extraction. So I would like to ask both of you to just elaborate on that, on the extractive nature of what is going on here, on the offloading of risk burden onto workers, and the extracting of value as the fundamental extractive relationship. We think about a mining company that goes into a village and just takes the gold and leaves the mess behind. What does that look like, in the life of a gig worker? I'm going to start with you, Veena, and then go to you, Wilfred.
Great. So I'm going to talk about two specific sites of extraction. One is sort of, I think, more well-known. Workers often talk about this as sharecropping. I have one of my interlocutors, a driver organizer who I work alongside a lot, Nicole Moore, talked about how their workers are borrowing from the equities of their cars in order to even go out and try and make money. So unlike say in the taxi world, where the capital was brought to the workers, in this case, the companies are, in addition to extracting the labor from the bodies of the workers, actually extracting their existing capital in order to have cars, out on the streets, in order to have those workers use their telephones. Every time there's anything that happens to a car, an exhaust or oil change or brake, they need new brakes, or an accident or whatever, that is something that the worker has to pay for it themselves. The other thing that I really want to focus on, that I think is less focused on in the United States and is actually quite important, is the data extraction. So it might be that Uber's primary source of income is ride hailing, or in the long term, it might be that their primary source of value is from the data that they collect every day, every time a worker moves their body in this system. And so they use that data in any number of ways. They can package it to sell the data. They can use it to inform their sort of own algorithmic control. But the reality is that is worth a lot of money. And drivers have no idea. They can only guess about how that data is being collected, what exactly is being collected, and how it is being used against them. And actually figuring that out in the latter point, how the data is being used against them is an everyday iterative process that workers engage in that is in itself a form of labor. So unlike, for example, a worker who gets an employee handbook when they join Walmart and they know the theoretical rules, an Uber driver is constantly figuring out the algorithmic rules that are meant to shape their behavior. And I'll give you a couple of examples. One is, a driver will frequently drivers have a time period when they have to work or can work. And so say a driver stops working every day at 5, and the system, the data sort of collected on that driver figures out, oh, well, this person must have something to do at 5. It is in the interest of the company to keep that person on the road for as long as possible. And so the worker will stop getting fares at 4. And this is, in stories of drivers that I've collected, stop getting work at 4 and then start getting a ton of fares at 5 to keep them on the road for as long as possible. Alternatively, a huge way that workers get income in this work is through bonus systems. And so, and those bonus systems are very personalized to each individual. So say you're working to get 20 rides in order to get a $100 bonus. As you get closer and closer and closer to that, getting those 20 rides, all of a sudden you may stop getting work because the system has figured out that that's where you are at. These are sort of just very basic things, basic ways that the data and algorithmic control are exert power over workers. But I think it's important to note that this is like a psychological, I'm trying not to curse and say mind F, but it is an extremely stressful and upsetting situation to not know what the rules of the road are while you are working. And so in addition to the data being used against the workers themselves, it is also potentially being used to create more and more value for the company in ways that are invisible to the workers. And there have been various solutions sort of thrown around data transparency, algorithmic transparency to get this to stop. But the reality is that having an algorithm on a PDF that someone has to review doesn't give workers a lot of power. And so, in my making, this just needs to end. The data collection needs to end. No matter who owns it, it can only really be used against people with little power, and there are a number of both sort of moral and privacy issues involved that lend themselves to suggesting and abolishing this kind of collection of extractive data.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, Wilfred, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, and also just kind of what it actually feels like to be a site of extraction.
Totally.
Yeah, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, the bodily aspect is something that you can't ignore because I'm a healthy. I just turned 30, right? But I was a healthy 20 something. Worker who I used to be on the cycling team in college. I considered myself a really athletic person, but I had knee pain, back pain, shoulder pain, all kinds of pain, and that was from me working a fraction of what a lot of the workers out there go through at twice my age, right? These are, for Chinese delivery workers who the Viking Public Project has worked with and done studies on, the average age of a worker is something like 46 or mid 40s, and they work sometimes 70 hours a week, riding up to 40 to 60 miles a day, right? And I'm doing a fraction of that, and I'm feeling it in my body. And so you see the way that their life force is really just being turned into they're just being ground into nothing for nothing, and it's really upsetting to me. The workers out there are aware of these business models that they have no choice but to kind of abet. They see these stories about the robots that Postmates is trying to develop in San Francisco that are going to replace them. These ghost kitchens that are popping up around the city, which are basically warehouses that just make food only for these delivery services. And so they see how Uber's trying to get rid of restaurants altogether. I mean, what they understand is that their bodies are being used literally to bootstrap, in tech parlance, bootstrap these new business models, right? That they are kind of the physical bridge between the old way of doing things and Uber's dystopian future. It's actually very similar to something like The Matrix, I think, or insert sci-fi movie here, where human bodies are really being turned into just capital, right, into power for these companies. And people do understand this. When you talk to people, you think of delivery workers as they don't have time to philosophize, but they do. I mean, and in the moments in between deliveries is when we get to talk about this, right? When we're waiting at the same restaurant and we have those couple of minutes before one of us gets another ping, where we get to trade notes, say, oh, how are you doing today? How's it going? And it's those kind of brief moments of solidarity that are both kind of what keeps you going, but also so depressing because half the time you don't see these people again. So you feel that atomization as well.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. That is such a vivid image. And that touches on something that I was going to ask you about later, about the challenges of the lack of a physical workplace in terms of organizing. I mean, what we just saw with Amazon and Bessemer is even with the physical workplace, when you're up against one of these giants, it's hugely challenging. But of course, even within those physical workplaces, there are all kinds of attempts being made to prevent that those physical interactions. And in many ways, COVID becomes a cover for that, right? Like, oh, well, you're violating social distancing rules. I see you too close to your coworker. So this raises a big question, because I think there was a point early on in the pandemic where certainly I naively felt, and others naively felt, like maybe this is a moment where people are going to stand up for gig workers, right? Including just kind of selfishly, right? Because if you don't have a sick day, if you can't take sick leave as a gig worker, then I'm not safe as a consumer, right? And yet things have gone in the opposite direction. So I want you both to maybe think about that. I want to bring in one of my students, Kelly, who also has a question about COVID. Kelly, are you ready to come ask your question? Or I also can read your question if it's tricky. I see you, Kelly.
Yeah, I can ask my question. I just wanted to, I can like reword it, but I just wanted to pull it up so I like don't forget anything, because I think I had a two-part question. I also just wanted to make a comment. All your comments about Uber is really interesting, because that is what my final project in this class is going to be about. So I agree with a lot of the things that you said. All right, let me just get this.
Just a heads up to everybody, get your questions ready for the next round.
Okay, so I wanted to ask, how do you think COVID has helped exhibit the flaws in the way jobs and work are conducted? And then what do you believe the biggest flaw uncovered actually is?
COVID as the great revealer.
Yeah.
So maybe you could just take whatever piece of this interests you most around the idea that maybe people might stand up, and also what's actually been revealed about these dynamics in the context of the ongoing pandemic. Maybe why don't we start with you, Wilfred?
Yeah, I mean, the thing that comes to mind first is just the way it totally confirmed for me and for workers that I've spoken to the sheer disrespect and disregard for workers' safety and lives, right? That has always been baked into this business model, but it just was so visceral, especially at the very beginning of the pandemic, when DoorDash was charging couriers as much as $40 to buy like this big thing of hand sanitizer. Because they said we have to ship it to you, and hand sanitizer is hard to make right now. So, but I mean, come on, like $40 is like half a day of work for a lot of delivery workers. And it's the one thing that people felt might have kept them safe at that point. Masks were impossible to find. And so it was stuff like that, right? And then the fact that they didn't do anything to kind of update their platforms to reflect all the restaurant closures. So you had people wasting hours of time going to restaurants that were actually shuttered because of the pandemic, and then other people going to these restaurants where there were hours, like literally hours of waiting time because everyone was trying to order from the same places. It was madness, and the companies were extremely slow to respond, and extremely reluctant to provide any kind of the thing that workers wanted, right, which was sick pay, hazard pay, sick leave. I mean, and the particularly insulting thing was that in many cases, companies like Uber and Postmates deliberately tried to block their workers from getting unemployment insurance. So, the Department of Labor needs a lot of payroll data to actually process some of these claims, right? PUA is the sort of federal program, Pandemic Unemployment Assistance, that was supposed to expand assistance to a lot of so-called independent contractors. But Uber and Postmates refused to hand over this data because it's not in their best interest for you to be sitting at home protecting yourself. They want you to be out there taking risks, and they don't really care if you die or get sick. And there were a couple cases where you had gig workers actually die of COVID, and their families didn't get anything because they were considered independent contractors. So that was just like the anger is very hard to describe. I mean, it was just it really fueled, I think, this desire to fight back in a lot of workers that I've spoken to, but that comes after survival. So we're still struggling with that.
Thanks. Professor Dubal, did you want to?
Yeah, I wanted to build a little bit on what Wilfred said, in so much as this really highlighted the life and death ramifications of what it means to have a class of people who are served and a class of people who do the service. And so, in addition to many workers actually contracting COVID and dying. The New York Taxi Workers Alliance, for example, when I was talking to them, I think in April and May, trying to get a sense of like what kinds of mutual aid organizing we could be doing to support these workers. The number of people in their membership who had died as a result of COVID was just astonishing, and they were actually looking for funds for funerals in addition to looking for funds to get people to have just food on the table. So I want to pick up a little bit on what Wilfred said with regard to the UI situation, the unemployment insurance situation, and I'm just going to share a little graph that I made. Can you see this Uber UI PUA benefit? Uber immediately, the jerks that they are, immediately Uber and Lyft started lobbying as soon as the pandemic hit, started lobbying Congress to make sure that independent contractors got unemployment insurance through federal government coffers and not through state coffers. And the reason for that was not from benevolence, but rather because they did not want their drivers to get unemployment insurance, as Wilfred said. And the reason that they didn't want them to do that is because they were going to have to pay millions, hundreds of millions in back taxes and penalties for not paying into unemployment insurance coffers. Ultimately, as part of the CARES Act, as a result of a big push by Bernie Sanders, we did get pandemic unemployment assistance for independent contractors. A lot of those funds improperly went to Uber and Lyft drivers, but in applying for these funds themselves, drivers had to make a really ugly, horrible decision So in California, where Uber Lyft drivers had been getting unemployment insurance for years as a matter of policy, all of a sudden the California EDD was having a hard time determining whether they were employees as per the law or independent contractors as per the companies, because as Wilfred said, they didn't have any payroll data. So there was a lot of confusion. You could appeal your determination when you were denied unemployment insurance if you were an Uber or Lyft driver, but it was unclear whether you were going to ever get a cent. The reason that this mattered, and alternatively, you could apply for pandemic unemployment assistance or PUA and get it overnight. The reason that this mattered was not just a matter of like morally who is going to pay for this, the companies or federal tax dollars. The reason that it matters was the amount was different, because for state unemployment insurance, this is an actual driver who I worked through his state unemployment insurance benefit with. His is based on gross income. So if he's waited for UI, which he could not afford to do, he would have got $440 per week based on his gross income for Uber. But PUA was calculated according to net income. And these are all the expenses that go into actually working for these companies, your car, your airport fee, all of this and more and more. Like this was just some of his expenses. And so his net income for the year was actually $21,000, and probably the most expensive place to live in the world. So per PUA, he was making $207 per week. And I say that just to say that I think a lot of people saw PUA as being a solution, a temporary solution to this misclassification issue for gig workers. But in fact, I think that it also posed the exact same unfair sort of issues that the larger sort of economy or this larger sector of work poses to workers every day.
Thank you both for that. I want to bring in Mercedes, who has a question. I think that relates particularly to the research that you were mentioning earlier, Veena, about racialized workers. Mercedes, are you ready?
Yeah. So you guys mentioned earlier about the POs. Sorry for the background noise. So my question is basically the perception of gig working, which we've been talking about, is just like retail and fast food workers, where most people believe that the workers are students, high school, college. There's that belief that they don't really deserve to raise the minimum wage. But the reality is most of them are immigrant POC workers with no formal education. So why do you believe this dichotomy exists?
There's such a long history of this, by the way. When I was in university, there was all the talk about the MIC jobs, and it was all the fast food companies that were like, these aren't real jobs. We don't have to pay real wages. It's just like kids who just want some pocket money. So this is a tactic that's been used for a while, right?
I'll let Wilfred answer it more substantively, but I do want to just highlight how this was used in the Prop 22 campaign. So at the same time as they were lowering the wages of these subordinated racial minorities that you mentioned, they kept arguing that this was going to be really good for those workers, and pointing to this idea, and this came through in their coalition with the California NAACP, that an employment model would result in disemployment, saying that this would actually, paying people fairly would actually take work away from hundreds of thousands of workers in California. And I will just say briefly on that, the data shows, as you said, Mercedes, that in fact, the majority of work done for these companies is done by workers who are working full time. They are not the students or the senior citizens or the people like as Wilfred pointed out that are just trying to make an extra buck and don't need the minimum wage. They are working full time or more than full time, doing the majority of work for the platform. And I will show, and maybe we can talk about this a little bit later. I wasn't going to talk. I can't help but talk about this paper that I'm I'm writing, but they really relied on, and you see this slide here, these are two images from the actual Prop 22 campaign. They really relied on the fact that there was a pandemic that highlighted the racialized inequality in this country, that there was a Black Lives Matter uprising as they were trying to pass this law. They flooded the airwaves, the internet waves, our mailboxes, email boxes, everything with images of smiling brown and Black workers, sort of embracing the fact that their workforce was primarily subordinated racial minority workers, and in effect saying that those workers somehow didn't deserve the same minimum wage or overtime protections that other workers enjoy and deserve.
The only thing that I'll add, and that was a really great answer, is just the fact that they also rolled out these Black Lives Matter solidarity billboards all over California and also in New York around the time of the Prop 22 campaign, which was just so insulting, right? And they have access to customers through push notifications, so they would send little messages that were just kind of cloaked in this progressive sounding language. And because they had so much money, they were able to just overwhelm all the people who were trying to fact check and point out that this is just not only, completely wrong, but a total insult to the workers who they're exploiting. But that's something that I feel has caused a lot of angst for workers and activists and thinkers trying to figure out how to fight back against this problem. Because if you're not with your nose to the ground, like folks on this call, are, you might just kind of like, oh, that's cool. They're a progressive company. They're helping out workers, right? So I guess I should help them. And that reminds me of one more thing, which is that they're right now asking people to donate rides for vaccine appointments, right? Which is ridiculous. Like I think Veena pointed this out on Twitter. Why you should donate the rides, right? Like let Uber donate the rides. Like why is Uber asking customers to to buy more rides through Uber for this, fake kind of social justice cause? And so, but they really get you, and we just have to be better at responding to that. And yeah, it's just going to require a lot of education, I think.
And this really gets my goat. And so I'm going to just share one more image with you before we go to the next question, if you don't mind. And that is to reference the slide that, to reference the particular billboard that Wilfred is talking about. This is their chief diversity officer tweeting that if you tolerate racism, you should delete Uber. And then this is an image. And of course, this was building on the New York Taxi Workers Alliance Delete Uber campaign during the Muslim ban a few years prior, sort of co-opting it. And this is an image of the workers who woke up one morning. This building right here is a popular nightclub frequented by Oakland's East African immigrant community. Right above it is this billboard, and workers the very next day organized a protest in front of it, outraged. One worker said that they were emotionally abusing their workers with this notion that they were somehow engaging in racial justice, when in fact they were taking wages away from workers through the law. And forgive, it's become a daycare outside of my office, so forgive the extra noise.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing those images. Yeah, it's almost as if they don't have any shame whatsoever. I would like to go to Sienna. Sienna, are you ready to ask your question?
Hi, yeah, I'm ready.
Thank you.
So my question is, so like in the modern era, much of political organizing happens on social media platforms, like whether that's Twitter or Facebook or Instagram. But like these digital spaces where these tech labor activists are organizing are owned by the tech conglomerates that they work for, or like the whole point about data extraction and all that. And so then in the wake of Disha Ravi's arrest in India, it's like clear that like a lot of these activists will be targeted. So I guess it's like, what are the implications of this dilemma? And then like, will tech companies use this to suppress labor participation and target organizers? And yeah.
Thanks, Sienna. That's actually a question similar to a question that another student of mine, Kevin, asked. about the dangers of organizing on, on Facebook and Twitter and on platforms that are built on extracting our data in order to take on other tech companies. Or it's obviously not a great situation, but how do we balance this?
Maybe I'll start just by saying that in the US, you have the theoretical right to organize in your workplace around wages and working conditions, to engage in mutual aid with other workers without fear, supposedly, of being terminated. This is a very weak right, in so much as we know it is very rarely enforced. The way in which it is enforced, if someone is terminated, if they're an employee, and I should say again, it's only protects employees. The way in which it is enforced is you file an unfair labor practice charge with the National Labor Relations Board, and maybe 2 to 5 years later, they find out that you were unlawfully terminated, and then the company has to put a big sign in their break room that says that they engaged in an unlawful labor practice. So it's a very, very weak right, although a theoretical right. I think a couple of things. So this would come up a lot. This comes up a lot in driver self-organizing. There are some workers who are very afraid to sort of be known that they are engaging in organizing because they can't afford to be terminated, and there are others who bear the risk. One thing that I hear driver organizers say all the time is that they are in a much better situation if they're acting collectively. So if there are tons of people organizing, then it is less likely that the firm or the company would terminate all of them. That said, I know that the companies know exactly who the organizers are, because during the Prop 22 campaign, I was the company's PR companies filed a Public Records Act request for all of my emails, and they particularly searched, were looking for my emails between me and driver organizers, and so they knew exactly who was doing what, and that is as a result of social media. But interestingly, they haven't terminated those people, and I don't know whether that is about I don't know if that's about like fear about public relations disasters or what, or that they don't want those workers to have more time to organize. But despite the fact that they knew precisely who the main organizers were, they didn't terminate them.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm just pausing because I do think it is pretty extraordinary that they went after your emails. And yeah, that's really something. Wilfred, I'd like to hear your thoughts on this, about this, the vulnerability of organizing, and yeah, whether you've seen people get fired, or is there kind of like a more subtle, like, hey, maybe I'm not getting as many jobs, and you don't really know, a kind of a head game with the algorithm.
There is a kind of paranoia. People use Reddit a lot, but some of the subreddits that are for couriers are actually set up by the companies, from what I've heard. It's kind of hard to confirm these things, but I've heard the same thing about Facebook groups where it says, NYC Postmates couriers, come here and talk about, everything. And then turns out the moderators are actually working for the company. So this is an area that's worth investigating, I think. To what extent are the companies playing these games, and are there unfair dismissals happening because of this? I also think about countries where this is already happening. I think India was mentioned. I'm thinking of China, where Chen Guojiang, who was a delivery worker organizer, was arrested in February, faces years in prison for trying to organize delivery workers through messaging apps. He had multiple groups where there were 14,000 workers kind of all chatting together. And so he's behind bars now. And of course, China has a more developed kind of like surveillance apparatus than we do here. But I think that underscores the need for this to really be an intersectional fight, where labor has to work together with people fighting in the data kind of arena, and know that these things are intimately connected and not things that we can kind of do work in silos.
Yeah, and I think that brings up a question around the role of the users of these apps, of consumers as well, and whether, I'm interested to know whether you have hope that is an organizing opportunity. with the recent Amazon organizing campaign, there wasn't a huge push for people who use Amazon to apply pressure or produce television shows for Amazon or sell books on Amazon. I mean, these are huge companies, and that creates potential if some of the more privileged, Veena used this phrase of the served and the servers and the served society, and that's been so heightened during the pandemic. But there's also more, at least, discourse of solidarity, and a lot of the questions are along these lines of like, what do we do next? What is the future? So let's maybe you can kind of scan the Q&A questions, which in the Q&A box, rather than reading them out loud. A lot of them have to do with building on the work that you're doing. There's a lot of gratitude for the work that you're doing. Mike has you mentioned that Prop 22 is not going to end in California. How can the AstroTurf campaigns be combated? There's so much money and resources against working people. Wilfred, one of the things that I was struck, in your writing, I mean, you're saying we've got to talk about Citizens United. Like we can talk tactics all we want, but ultimately it's about these companies flooding the media markets in ways that shouldn't be allowed. So let's talk about Citizens United a little bit and other sort of getting to the root responses.
Yeah, I mean, it's just unbelievable that they were able to pull off what they were able to pull off, right? How could that happen? And also make it so hard to overturn, make Prop 22 so hard to overturn with that clause that says that you need 7/8 of the state legislature to actually do anything that could affect, the intention of Prop 22. And they were able to just buy that with $205 million. I think it ended up being a little higher than that, including all the bonuses they paid their software engineers, and so Citizens United obviously was that big turning point where a lot of this floodgate of political money kind of came roaring into the system. And like we can talk about these different kinds of resistance here and there, but I mean, I do think I completely agree that has to be at the core of the conversation as well. But I will also, just on the kind of broader topic of what do we do, something that workers have emphasized to me over and over, and activists, unionists, folks who are commentating on this, is that it really ultimately has to come from a worker-led movement. It's not going to be like a really good hashtag that like finally fells these giants, or people boycotting Amazon and not using Prime or something. I mean, people have tried to do that, and those are important things, but ultimately the workers know the way, right? And so I just wanted to kind of echo what people have been telling me over and over.
If I could just say one
please.
thing, I'm sorry, just to add to that, like absolutely, Citizens United is the core of much of this. And just to say that in California, in politics, you can lie about the nature of the initiatives in the advertising that you do, and that is precisely, I think, what these companies did in saying in every single advertisement that this was about providing 120% of the minimum wage to workers, when it was really about only providing that amount during engaged time, which is something like 50% of the time that people are actually working. I also want to say one specific thing that I think we could have done better that we didn't do in California, and that this is something that both the workers themselves want done and do, and that the responsibility can fall more on the advocacy organizations and the unions, and that is to form strong relationships between civil rights organizations and labor rights organizations. And so the companies are, with their boatloads of money, are so good at going in and donating money to the National Action Network, to the National Urban League, to the NAACP, and forming these alliances. When I reached out to some of the civil rights organizations that I work with and tried to explain the law to them and why it was so complicated, it was hard for them to fully grasp what was going on. And I think that the failure, or one of the big failures in my mind of the labor movement of the last century, or of the mainstream labor movement over the last century, is failing to find these alliances between labor rights and civil rights, despite the fact that these violences, these economic violences and these violences of dignity are occurring on the bodies of the same exact people. And so that is one very specific thing that I hope, as we fight the proliferation of this law elsewhere, that we take into account.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly, once you look at it, it lights up so many other issues. And one of the things that that I've seen in some of the research into who is relying on this. Hello. This is one of the great mysteries of, as I watch your work, Veena, is just how much you get done with these adorable little humans running around. I will never know. I barely managed with a bigger one, but clearly they're perfect angels.
And this bed sheet that separates me from them is actually the secret.
But they figured out that they can get through it. So in Uberland, which is a book that we've read a little bit of, and it's interesting that the author is now working at Uber. But it talks about how a lot of people who start working for the platform companies see it as a stopgap, right? And that it relates to the lack of any kind of social safety net in the United States, right? So it acts as a kind of a shock absorber because there is no social safety net. I'd love to hear both of you on that and how this relates to other core struggles like Medicare for all and real unemployment insurance. And yeah,
that's absolutely right. And something that I'm very struck by when I speak to workers, just on the street or whatever, is especially when I speak to immigrants, and a lot of them actually have, they're doing school part-time. They don't see themselves as delivery workers. They see themselves as doing this for a while on their way to doing something else, regardless of how much ground they're actually gaining, right? And a lot of them are not gaining a lot of ground at all. But I think that makes them often internalize the myth that the gig companies are so good at putting out, which is that there is a trade-off between flexibility and sort of labor rights, right? So when you ask them, what do you like about doing gig work? They go, oh, well, I mean, I like being an independent contractor because I get the flexibility and I can work whenever I want. And, and of course, not everyone says that, but a lot of people do. And that comes from, just how bleak it is outside of, as you said, this kind of shock absorber, right? Where you have people just being overworked and exploited also in traditional employment. And then there's nowhere that's trying to offer both the flexibility and the labor rights that are actually possible under labor law. And so it seems like this is some kind of good alternative when really it's just like, a bargain with the devil. So you really do have to address the broader precarity in this country in order to make sure that, even if you take down Uber, that another Uber-like entity doesn't come up and try to fill this void of like people who are just trying their best to find some kind of agency in their working lives. And I think that's if we can't do that, it's going to be very hard to make a case to all these precaritized workers that they shouldn't be trying to pursue these kind of exploitative jobs, and that what they really need to do is fight for unionization or insert any number of solutions that commentators and kind of people on the left would prefer to see happen. But for a lot of workers, there's a big gap, and that gap comes from the economic oppression and exploitation that's happening outside of this realm.
Yeah, thank you. Did you want to add anything to that, Veena?
Just very quickly that, just to add to what your original point was, Naomi, just that what makes these companies possible, what makes what creates the labor market workforce of people who are at the very margins is precisely what you laid out, which is the fact that we have such a severely broken safety net in this country that is disconnected from work itself. And I would also just say that, you know, workers in my work doing interviewing and studying taxi workers prior to the advent of Uber drivers said the same thing, that they started doing this work as a stopgap while they were you know, in school, or you know, as they were studying for something, or in between jobs, and that is sort of self-narratizing that helps to explain how people end up there, but it doesn't preclude the reality that ultimately these people are there for good because they are pushed to the margins of the economy, and that the people that do this for the longest, the people that do most of the work for these companies are people who maybe would love to imagine themselves in a different place, but who are for various structural reasons stuck there. And so, you know, as you said, the companies love to say, oh, this is a step up for people. This is just like a boost. No one does this for real. This isn't meant to be real work, but it is real work. And for the most precarious people, it is terrible real work.
Right. And a lot of what people like about it, including flexibility, and there are a couple of, you know, people with questions, including students of mine who, you know, who work at DoorDash and have appreciated that kind of flexibility. I'd love to hear both of you comment on whether this is the only way to provide flexibility, right? Because that's another powerful narrative in the background, that it isn't possible to ask for flexibility if you happen to have a real job, right? Or have any self-determination. So maybe we can open it up to different organizing models, different responses. Some of this is happening in different countries. Could we use the best of what these platforms enable to have worker co-ops, to have, you know, real empowerment on the job? Let me start with you, Wilfred, because you indicated you wanted to talk about some of these examples.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'll just highlight a couple examples. One is the UK Supreme Court ruling that basically said that you know, these contracts that Uber is signing with independent their workers can't supersede labor rights legislation, and these workers are workers, which is kind of, without going into too much detail, a kind of intermediate category in the UK between independent contractor and employee, but that are entitled to minimum wage and paid time off and some of the benefits that we associate with employees in the United States. And what was surprising and interesting is that Uber, who has long said that if this happened, that they would have no choice but to shut down their business, that this is simply unsustainable for them, has not shut down their business and actually acknowledged the ruling and said that they would move to, you know, treat their UK drivers as workers. Now, that's, you know, the bad news is that they're refusing to comply fully with what the UK Supreme Court said about minimum wage, which is that it needs to be for the entire time that you're signed onto the app, right? Not just the time that you're having a passenger in the back or delivering some food. And that's a huge difference, because so much of a gig worker's time is spent waiting for orders by design. That's how, you know, that's how they can do this super on-demand kind of thing, is just have a glut of surplus labor, right? But the point being that the UK Supreme Court did do this unanimous ruling, you know, and there was no alternative way to justify Uber's position. Uber lost 4 times in a row from the bottom kind of employment court all the way up to the Supreme Court. And so this is a really positive development for a lot of countries, like such as Commonwealth jurisdictions that are kind of looking to UK rulings for precedent and figuring out how they should do things, but really just for all gig workers and seeing, look, you can actually bring these companies to heel in court, and they won't actually, like, the world won't end. We can still have work and we can still do this, right? Another thing that I wanted to highlight is that in France and in Italy, maybe some other countries that I'm missing, but there's a big company called Just Eat Takeaway. another huge player in global food delivery, which has signed these collective bargaining agreements, CBAs, with their workers, and this comes amid a context of a lot of legislative and judicial activity in the European Union that's seeking to rein in these tech companies, right? And so Just Eat Takeaway, from my understanding, and other people would have a fuller picture of this, is that they're trying to get ahead of this. They're trying to say, okay, we see which way this is going, and we should actually just sign these collective bargaining agreements with the workers. And look, they're still doing okay. I mean, Uber hasn't done it yet, but Just Eat Takeaway has shown that it's actually possible to treat your workers as something more than just these totally atomized independent contractors.
Those are great examples. Yeah, Professor Dubal.
To answer the question about flexibility that your student raised, I've just thrown in a link here to a economic study that shows that flexibility wouldn't have to be taken away, and actually looked at what an employment model would result in California. And I think it's really important to emphasize that this is not flexibility for workers. Sometimes people who work for a short time for these companies really feel like this is so great, they can just turn on their app and start working. But if you work over a period of time, if you work, say, longer than a year or so, I think that people will tell you, especially if you rely on this for your livelihood, that this is not flexible work, and that you can only work during certain times to earn money, that the companies actually incentivize you through these behavioral modification strategies where they combine social scientists and data scientists to use what we know about how people respond to behavioral incentives to push people to work in particular ways, so as to appear to not be controlling, but to actually be controlling people quite vigorously. And I wanted to make 2 points about the things that Wilfred talked about. One is that, interestingly, in the UK, despite the very clear wording of this decision that says that these workers should be paid for all of their time, that they continue to only pay them for engaged time. This will be something that is litigated a lot over the next few years. And then in the Just Eats context, what's interesting is that Just Eats uses staffing agencies. So they hire their workers through staffing agencies, and it's it's an example of how employment status is not a panacea. They hire through staffing agencies. It's less flexible scheduling work, and workers sort of feel differently about it, which is why I'm excited about the CBAs. I'm excited to see sort of what emerges from them. I think we have someone from the ITF actually on and the attendees who's been watching this quite closely and could reflect better than I. But it's I don't want to give Just Eats too much credit.
All right, we only have a few minutes left. This has really flown by, and I just hope maybe scan the questions in the Q&A if there's anything you want to just address directly. Some concerns about your emails, Veena, but also just a lot of appreciation for the way your remarks are complementing each other. Okay, let's talk about Biden. Let's talk about what we should be looking for, and also what we can be doing. There's a question from Sharon about bringing up, raising more awareness and engaging people on this. There have been a few questions along those lines. We've seen that this administration is vulnerable to pressure. We also know that the Obama-Biden administration had a revolving door with a lot of these companies. I think we've seen some encouraging appointments and some discouraging appointments. How do we know if real progress is being made? What should we really be pushing for in the coming months from this administration? Maybe in particular that could have the potential to prevent Proposition 22 from nationalizing.
Yeah, so I think that there is some opportunity here for the Department of Labor to initiate at least an investigation into whether or not Prop 22 violates the Fair Labor Standards Act. Certainly the Congress did not intend for app deployed workers to not have access to the minimum wage. And so there is an issue of federalism here that I think that the administration could certainly at least investigate. And also, of course, and Wilfred maybe can comment on this more, but we are all eagerly anticipating or at least pushing for the passage of the PRO Act. If the filibuster is ended, which is something that the Biden administration could work on, I think that the PRO Act might pass the Senate, which would be a huge boon for labor organizing in this country. It would not be a panacea at all, but it would really deal with some of these structural issues of limitations on organizing in the U.S. And as to what each of you can do in addition to encouraging, I guess, your electoral representatives to do the right thing on the PRO Act. I think that, there's a fascinating and amazing coalition between tech workers, white collar tech workers and blue collar tech workers that's sort of burgeoning. And I'll put a link in the chat. The organizers are trying to create sustained funding for self-organizing workers in California, the Rideshare Drivers United. And so the white collar tech workers sort of organized this campaign to grow that, to make that organizing more possible. The link is there. And I think also just making, as Naomi alluded to earlier, making ethical choices and choosing to use the service of companies that treat their workers with a modicum of dignity and respect.
Thank you. Wilfred, closing thoughts.
Sure, I echo everything that Veena just said. The only thing I guess I can add is look at all the amazing examples outside of the US of workers organizing as well. Ruin from the ITF, I think, is one of the attendees. ITF is doing amazing work. The IAATW, another organization that's formed as kind of umbrella group of different workers orgs across the world. That's the International Alliance of App-Based Transport Workers. You have, TWU in Australia has had some amazing victories. There's a group called Riders X Derechos in Spain, Riders X Rights, which has been doing won a lot of stuff as well for workers in Spain. Gig Workers United in Canada. So these are all just there's so many lessons to be learned from stuff that they've achieved, and they're learning from American organizers like Rideshare Drivers United, being just an incredibly inspiring group, and the New York, Taxi Workers Association Alliance over here. So there is hope, right? There's a lot of leadership happening, and as a journalist, I'm just I just feel grateful to be able to write about it and to be part of these conversations. So I don't know. There's a lot to fight for. Is my closing remark, I guess.
Thank you so much. That's a great note to end on. And once again, I've just been delighted to be able to host you both. And I want to thank Nicole Weber, Kylie Davidson, who made this event happen behind the scenes. All of my students for your great questions, even if I didn't get to you, it informed the questions that I asked. And all of the questions in the chat as well. I'm really sorry. It flew by. What can I say? We have just had incredible speakers. But I really appreciated that people came out despite Zoom fatigue. Thank you so much. And I'll see you on some other platforms sometime, my friends. Take care, everybody.
Take care. Be well. Thank you for this opportunity. And I loved listening to you both chat.
Thank you. Let's
Thank
pass
you so
the
much.
PRO Act, people.